Hello friends, so I welcome you to the class of business to business marketing, and we will continue from where we had left in the last lecture. So in the last lecture we were discussing about the importance of relationship in the business to business market, right. So why it is important we all know, right. It is very important because the lack of customers or very few customers that you have in the B2B market and the customized needs. So there are certain situations which are completely different, which makes it different, from the B2C market. So moving into the today's lecture, let's start with this small, quote. So this is from Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, who said, "Get closer than ever to your customers. So close, in fact, that you tell them what they need well before they realize it themselves." So, Steve Jobs, this quote makes a lot of sense because he says that every supplier or every seller, so or the buyer seller relationship should be so strong that the seller should be in a position to advise or suggest the buyer what it needs before even the buyer realizes it, right. So this is what in today's world makes data analysis and data interpretation more important, because all this cannot be possible. This such a kind of strong relationship between the buyer and seller cannot be possible until unless we understand their needs. And to understand their needs, maybe we have to understand, identify their problems, their issues. So and those things only can be relevant or can be understood by even looking at the end customers of their buyers, right. So if a supplier today has to create a good relationship, or you know create a long time relationship with its buyers or its customers, then it needs to understand them very closely, very properly, very well, right. So CRM, which says basically is a process in which you know a business or other organization administers its interactions with customers, right. So typically by using data, so using the data or analyzing the data, right, and creating certain information out and understanding this information, and then helping the customer or the buyer to for a proper decision making process. So CRM has become a very important tool in today's world, and no company can succeed without understanding CRM or investing properly into CRM, right. So when I say companies like Cisco, Sony, or when I say let's say companies like Siemens, these are companies who have invested heavily into their CRM, CRM. Why? Because they have GE. So all the great names, if you see, these companies have invested heavily, right? Because in order to understand their their customers, their buyers in a much better way. Okay. So we will continue. We were discussing in the last lecture about the buyer seller relationship. So let us start from there. So the spectrum of buyer seller relationships. Now buyers and sellers craft various relationships in response to the market condition and the characteristics of the purchase situation. So looking at this, this is adapted from this source is given to you. So you can see certain characteristics, for example, certain important points are availability of alternatives, supply market dynamism, importance of purchase, complexity of the purchase, information exchange, and operational linkages. Now what it says is, in if you look at the two extreme ends, that this is where the value added stays, but if you go to one end, the transactional exchange, and the other end the collaborative exchange, where here you behave like a partner, right, partner. So if you look at it, the availability of alternatives, there are many alterations or many alternatives, okay, and here there are only very few alternatives. So in a collaborative exchange, we as I said in the last lecture, most companies today are reducing their supply base to a very few, right. They want to from a multiple supplier theory, they are coming to a single supplier theory, so that most of the businesses they can do with their single suppliers, and they can, so that they can trust them and their loyalty is created. The supply market dynamism has to be is stable in this case, in a transactional exchange case, and here in this case it is very volatile, right. So, in order, when there is volatility, the best thing to the best way to reduce volatility is to have a strong relationship. So, a strong relationship will help to understand each other better. The buyer and the seller, they can understand each other well, and accordingly they can help each other, so that this uncertainty is reduced. Similarly, when the importance of purchase of a product is low, at that time maybe a company can go for a transactional relationship. That means I can buy the product and just look at the price component, and whoever supplies me at a lower cost, I will buy from that supplier. But if the importance of purchase for the product is very high, for example, as we know, there is a B, C classification theory, right. So, these are the most important, right, high valued but less volume, high value, less volume, right, volume, and this is low valued, right, and this is high volume, right, and B is medium. So, when you have a situation, when you are dealing with products which are high valued products and which make a significant impact on the profitability of the firm. So, here in a collaborative relationship, we look into this thing, right, it should be very contributing very significantly. Similarly, if the complexity of purchase is very high, we go for a collaborative exchange, and if it is low, we will go for a transactional relationship. Complexity of the purchase, in the sense we mean the number of suppliers available, the kind of paperwork, or the kind of purchase order, releasing the purchase order, or even ordering the item. All these things, how complex it is, that it depends on that, right. So, if it is a low purchase complexity is available, then somebody can go for a transactional relationship. But if the complexity of purchase is very high, which is especially true in certain B2B items, right, because the product might be a huge product, or it could be a very complicated product with several sub parts or sub assemblies. Okay. Similarly, when information, in terms of information exchange in the transactional relationship, there is no information exchange, but in the collaborative relationship, since the product, the buyer and the seller work like partners, so there is a very high information exchange, right. And similarly, in terms of the operational linkage, right, so there is very limited or almost no linkage, right, and here there is a very severe or very deep operational linkage. That means most of the operational, in terms of the supply chain, in terms of the delivering the product, the loading, the unloading, the input, the inbound logistics, the outbound logistics, and the production processes, they are so streamlined that in the collaborative exchange, right, the buyer and the seller, right, they try to be in the such a so streamlined that there is no wastage of time. For example, when you talk about, let's say, is let's say there is a buyer, let's say there is a buyer, okay, and the buyer has a production process. This is the production process. Now, the seller in a collaborative relationship is expected to deliver the item in the right time, which is called JIT, and deliver at the right place, right. So, there is no wastage of time, there is no loading, unloading issues, and there is no storage issues. Okay. The company would not love to store the product, because storage itself takes space and cost. So, the buyer would look for such suppliers or sellers who can understand their needs and in the right time can deliver the products. One thing that affects which this relationship is the switching cost. The buyer seller relationship is affected by the switching costs. A major consideration before changing suppliers. Now, what happens when somebody wants to change a supplier, right? So, let us say I am a buyer and I am buying, let us say, certain parts or certain items from various suppliers. Now, if there are, let us say, supplier 1, 2, 3, and I have been buying from supplier 1 all the time, now I want to buy from supplier 2, let us say, then there is certain switching cost involved, right, and this switching cost can affect the buyer seller relationship. So, buyers invest heavily in supplier relationships like training, documentation, integration, process modifications, okay, hiring specialized skill sets, contracting, all these things are sometimes the buyers invest heavily. Okay. Now, switching cost can cause disruptions. As I said, now because I am switching from one supplier to other, it is not very easy, like it is not like a B2C model. In the B2B, you need to make certain changes, you need to make certain alternatives or some alterations. Okay. Now until unless you make those alterations, you cannot use the second supplier's products. So B2B market, industrial markets are highly customized markets. Okay. So if you want to change something, there has to be a change in your production processes also. Okay. So moving to less established suppliers sometimes can be risky. The prospect's problem must exceed the benefits. Now in terms of switching costs, we say the problem, that means the, or let us understand in simple terms, that the cost that we bear must be less than the benefits that we get, right? Or the problems that we are we are facing should be much less than the benefits that we are getting, right? So the prospect's problem must exceed the benefits experiencing with the current supplier before consideration. So if the reverse is true, that means the problem is, let us say there is a supplier, there is a buyer. Now if in this case the relationship, in this relationship the problem is more than the benefits that the buyer is getting, then the buyer would like to switch from this supplier to some other supplier, right? Otherwise, it is expected that to have a smooth relationship, the problem should always be less than the benefits that is the buyer is getting. Okay. So as it says, good marketers seek to establish high switching costs through value added services. So this switching cost becomes a very important parameter in understanding buyer supplier relationships in the B2B market. So companies tend to avoid switching from one seller to the other until unless they get certain very significant benefits out of it. So if you look at this case, you can see that this is a purely transactional from to a purely collaborative. So in such kind of very complex items, there has to be a collaborative relationship, and this kind of a very commodity kind of a product, which is a corrugated box. So in this kind, you don't need any assistance or anything. So here a company or a buyer may go for only low price for such kind of products. So price becomes the most determinant, the biggest determinant in the relationship, right? And this is sometimes you can consider to be a value added relationship kind of a thing, right? So let us take this example of Hero Cycles, which is a large manufacturer of bicycles in India, and which buys precision steel tubes. Okay. Precision steel tubes are the major component for bicycles. If you want to make a bicycle, it is very important, it is required, one of the main parts. So from three tube manufacturers. Okay. And how did it buy? It purchased it on basis of whenever it required. So on basis of the timely delivery. So whenever it required, so as a JIT, they would give an order, place an order, and from on basis of the good quality and all and price, they would give the order. So these three suppliers were supplying 50%, 30% and 20%, right? 20%. So now this is an purely example where the company was buying on basis of the price, right? Now on the other hand, if you will see companies like Maruti Suzuki, right, which has the highest market share of cars in India, they developed a partnership or partnering relationship or a collaborative relationship with many vendors, okay, in the ancillary manufacturing units. And these ancillary unit providers or these small companies who had a collaborative relationship with Maruti Suzuki, they not only provided the sold the product to them at a competitive price and in a right time and all, but they also provided proper technical support, right? And both Maruti Suzuki provided technical support to them, and the vendor helped Maruti Suzuki in receiving the feedback from the market and helping them in their development processes in the of the new products. Okay. So as a result of it, what happened? Both the buyer and the seller, Maruti Suzuki and the selling component sellers, they both gained, and Maruti Suzuki always treated them like business partners. So this kind of a relationship is extremely useful, and in a long term perspective, it helps the company in better forecasting, better reducing uncertainty and understanding the client's needs better from a marketing perspective. Okay. Now buyer seller relationships or interactions, Professor Jagdish said, right, he talks about two major factors responsible, right. So, he says the content of information and the style in which the information is exchanged are very important. The successful interaction between the buyer and seller will take place only when the buyer and seller are compatible in both content and style. Now, what do you mean by content? Now, when he talks about, he speaks that content is like product feature, prices and services, okay. And style, he tries to say is, so from style point of view, is mannerisms and format used to communicate. Now, what mannerisms and how you are, what formats you are using to communicate between the, to have a communication between the buyer and seller is something very important, right, to keep this relationship healthy and move from a transactional to a collaborative relationship or a partnership relationship. Now, if you look at this buyer seller relationship interact or interactions, now style of interaction is on this side on the x axis, and content of information is on the y axis. Now, if it is compatible content or incompatible content, right, style of interaction similarly is compatible style or incompatible style. So, what he says is when the when both are compatible, right, it is an ideal interaction. So, this is an ideal interaction if both the style is compatible and the content is also compatible. Content, we had seen that products, the kind of price and everything, all those things, right, mostly the tangible part. Now, if the content is good or compatible, but the style is not compatible, it is an inefficient interaction. So, it is not efficient. Similarly, if one of them, any one of them, this one the content is incompatible and the style is compatible, then again it is an inefficient interaction. And if both are incompatible, then there would be no interaction, right. So, the only ideal situation is this one, and these two there is a scope for improvement, right. So, basically this buyer seller relationship and how the way the interaction happens is a very complex process, and companies are today trying to reduce it and they are trying to make it more easier, right. The simple reason being, you see, when two business organizations are having a relationship, right, as a buyer or seller or a, whatever. So, in such a condition, what happens, the amount of business that they make is very huge, very enormous, and the scope of the business is also very high. As a result, large number of people, large number of vendors, several processes are involved. So, which makes the entire process a little complex process. So, in order to reduce its complexity, companies need to put in sincere efforts, okay. And if they do that, that would help them in improving their profitability, right. But this exercise is a very important and tough exercise. Now, what we talk about is when we talk about customer profitability. Now, how do you measure? One important thing is we measure it through activity based costing, which is a method where the allocation is done on basis of, so it allocates cost of performing various services to each customer. For example, now how is somebody performing, right, how is a customer or a seller performing. On basis of that, every activity, on basis of the various activities involved, each activity is subdivided or broken into parts, and on basis of each activity the the performance is measured, okay. So, this is something sometimes can be understood as customer specific costing. So, let us say a seller has various customers, okay, C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, or reverse also is true that one customer can have several now sellers, let us say S1, S2, S3, S4, S5. So, how do you allocate, how do you understand the performance? Now, it depends on each customer about the specific process, a specific activity, right. Now, customer relationship management programs help in understanding this revenue, the cost generated in relation to each activity, okay. How much profit we are generating from each of these activities, how much of sales we are making, and what is the entire revenue generation, and what is the future scope, potential revenue generation. Everything can be measured with the help of a proper CRM process. Now, by linking financial information with the transactional data created in the CRM programs, companies are able to accurately calculate the cost to service. Now, let us say if I am giving a service, now how much is it costing me? The company wants to know, so that once it can understand the cost to service, then it can also understand that some clients might not be very profitable in nature and some clients can be heavily profitable in nature. So, then that selection of clients can be also judiciously made by the companies. Okay. Differentiation and customization are costly. Differentiation and customization both are costly, because that is an unique thing that has to be given to the customer, but must always revisit the ROI assumptions. That means, it when you are trying to differentiate, create a differentiation in the market, or you are trying to customize your product according to the need of the customer, one has to compare or one has to calculate this on basis of the return on investment assumptions. So, if you are sufficiently getting returns, then one can get into it. How do we unlock customer profitability? Now, here there is a case of a Kanthal, a heating wire manufacturer. So, this case, this company was a client to General Electrics, right. So, General Electric was one of its largest and most coveted accounts. So, Kanthal, as we are talking about activity based costing. So, Kanthal was one of the clients of Kanthal was GE, okay, and GE was giving it almost most of its revenue was coming from GE, but it was also one of the most unprofitable accounts. Now, that is very interesting. The largest account, but the largest but unprofitable, right. So, the question is, you must be thinking, why was Kanthal then working with General Electric in this case? It is not easy, because most of the time a small company can be working with a large company due to some kind of a pressure, some kind of some kind of maybe lack of information. Sometimes it could be simple, like they do not want to give up the big business, because at least it is giving them a large business, a steady business. So, the question is, but anyway Kanthal was not gaining. A processing cost of $150 would go up to 600 due to frequent order changes. Now, why were they becoming unprofitable? Now, one general processing cost of an order which should have been $150 was going up to maximum $600 due to the frequent order changes, expected expedited deliveries. That means, suddenly GE would come up with an order and expect Kanthal to deliver it as soon as possible. So, that was improving the logistics cost and everything, and scheduling adjustment for GE, right. This loss was also for GE, it was not only for Kanthal, right, it was also for GE. So, now because of this this problem, Kanthal was not making any profits, although it was getting a large business from General Electric. GE gave the largest order to Kanthal and incorporated a surcharge for any change made to an existing order and established a minimum order size. Now, what finally was done, GE gave the largest order to Kanthal, this company, and incorporated a surcharge for any change, right. If there would be any change, GE would add up to the cost. It is like a self penalty, right. They imposed on themselves, so that GE also would not make frequent order changes, go for some sudden demands and all, which was creating trouble to their vendor, the supplier. As a result of it, the seller became a profitable seller, and this account became a profitable account for Kanthal after a certain period of time. So, business relationships are very important, because now in this case, if you see, because GE understood the importance of Kanthal and Kanthal was reluctant to leave GE, so they came up with a solution where both gained. Okay. Now, let us see how this is through a whale curve, which is talks about the the cumulative profitability. Now, if you look at this curve, right, this is a cumulative profits in the y axis, which is a percentage of the total profits, and the type of customers, most profitable and the least profitable customers. Now, if you look at this curve, it tells you that the profitability, right, goes up for certain for the most profitable customers, right. So, the cumulative profits is going up, and after a certain period of time it goes on decreasing, right, with the least profitable customers. So, it becomes very important for B2B businesses to understand what kind of a client you are managing, right. If the client is, you are not gaining out of this client, or you are this the profitability is not high, then it is wise to rethink about the plans. Okay. Now, this whale curve and profitability, this says 20-80 rule, as per it works on the 20-80 Pareto's principle, which says 20% of customers provide 80% of the sales, right. Now, this curve reveals that 20% of customers generate 150 to 300% of the total profits. Now, look at this. If you create a dotted line, right. So, and this is if we create this dotted line. So, you can see around 250 or more than 250 percentage of profit almost comes from only 20-25% of the customers. 70% of the customers break even, 10% of the customers lose from 50 to 200% of the total profit. So, this helps us to understand that only few customers give us most of the benefits, but so this becomes highly important to understand that in the B2B business, it is very important to understand the client, the customer, and how is the seller getting a profit out of it, right. The reverse is also true, but we will talk from the supplier and the buyer perspective. So, here we are saying the supplier needs to understand out of its many customers, which customers are the ones which are giving them the highest profit or maximizing their profit, and which customers are eating up their profits, right. So, once they can understand, they can prioritize their business idea and create a better opportunity for those highly profiting customers, so that the relationship exists more strongly and they get into a more collaborative relationship with those highly profitable customers, and maybe deal differently with the loss making or the low profitable customers, right. With this, we will wind up today's lecture, and we will meet in the next lecture. Till then, take care and thank you very much.